Noswaith dda. Good evening. Nawr, eich gras Archesgob Caergaint, eich gras Archesgob Cymru, Llenyddion a Llenyddiaethau gyfeillion. The Grace, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Archbishop of Wales, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Ar ran Llenyddiaeth Cymru, y cwmni hyrwyddo Llenyddiaeth Genedlaethol, yn pleser i'w eich croesawu chi yma i Amgueddfa Genedlaethol Cymru. On behalf of Literature Wales, the National Literature Promotion Organisation, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this special event to celebrate a new initiative to promote literary tourism. Felly diolch yn fawr I chi gyd am ddod. Thank you all very much for coming. My name's Graham Davis and I'm a board member of Literature Wales and I'll be introducing proceedings this evening. First of all, I have to do the essential housekeeping announcements. Now, I can't imagine that an event attended by not only two archbishops, but also by the National Poet of Wales, and also in the presence of no fewer than two John the Baptists, as they could possibly be hit by an outbreak of fire. But should such an unlikely event arise, please suspend any meditations on the vagaries of Providence until after you have exited the building. Now, if the museum's fire alarm is activated, please follow the instructions of the museum assistants, and they are standing and are clearly visible at the back and sides of the hall. The museum assembly point is in the park opposite the main steps. Fire exits are clearly indicated. The ladies and gents cloakrooms are through the double doors on the left and at the end of that gallery. The whole museum and premises is a no-smoking area. Please take any papers or documents with you at the end of the event. And finally, please turn off mobile phones. Now, of course, I hope the only fire tonight will be the figurative fire of the passion we all share for the literary heritage of this land. Achos dyn ni yma heno I lansio rhaglen gyffroes I ddyfnhau ac I ehangu perthynas pobl gyda llenyddiaethau'r gornel hon o'r byd. The programme we're launching tonight is intended to help extend and deepen people's relationship with Wales's rich and captivating literary heritage. In a moment, we'll hear from the new Chief Executive of Llenyddiaeth Cymru, Literature Wales, with her vision for the organisation and for a new literary festival at Ddigwyddiadau Castle. Then we'll hear from one of our most distinguished novelists, Tessa Hadley, sharing her experiences of a literary tour. And finally, we are honoured to have the presence of the Most Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams, who will be telling us what the literatures of Wales mean to him. Ac yr ydyn ni'n edrych ymlaen at hynny yn fawr iawn. We're honoured also to have the Most Reverend Dr. Barry Morgan, the Archbishop of Wales, here. Although I have been wondering actually how it is possible to have two people who are both the Most Reverend at the same time. It has been puzzling me the last few days. I'm sure there's an explanation. Now, Archbishop Barry is himself, I know, a great lover of Welsh literature, particularly the work of the great poet-priest R.S. Thomas, on whom he has written his own thoughtful appreciation. But first, let me tell you a little more about the Literary Tourism programme. This is an exciting series of 14 new adventures exploring Wales's historic and contemporary literatures by train, boat, barge and bus, on horseback and on foot, and in all parts of Wales, and for adults and for young people, and in English ac, of course, and in Gymraeg. Now, this is actually a contemporary and professionalised take on an activity which has quite a long pedigree. I'm thinking of literary tourism as a whole. However, prior to the work of a dedicated agency like Literature Wales, early attempts at literary tourism were not always quite so professional. Here is an early example from a very prominent literary pilgrim to Wales, George Borrow. Writing in 1862 in Wild Wales, Borrow records his visit to the home of the 17th century poet Hugh Morris in Glencairiog. Borrow was determined to see the memorial seat cut into the hillside near the poet's home. So he dragged his hapless guide the householders and their servants through a wilderness of nettles and broken branches in the pouring rain to see it. Borrow remarks unconcernedly, "In a little time we were wet to the skin and covered with the dirt of birds." Now when he finally got there, Borrow took off his hat and addressed his departed hero in Welsh and at great length, while his companions waited in the downpour. Borrow said they listened to him, he says, patiently and approvingly. Now, even recent attempts at literary pilgrimage can sometimes go awry. Last September, I was staying with the distinguished American poet Bob Pullman in Literature Wales's wonderful residential centre at Tynewith, near Llanystumdwy. And we went for a drive to explore the literary heritage of North Wales, and on an impulse we decided to visit St Beino's College at Tremeirchion in Flintshire, which of course, as you know, is where Gerard Manley Hopkins learned Welsh, invented his sprung rhythm and became a poet. Now, we were already on the road, so we decided to claim a stranger's privilege and turn up there unannounced. When we arrived at lunchtime, we found the place strangely silent. Only when we had knocked loudly and repeatedly on the big wooden door and roused some of the residents did we find out why it was so quiet. The college was full of people on a 30-day silent Jesuit retreat. Well, Father Damien, a wonderful chap, was very gracious and gave up his lunch hour to show us around, quietly. So you see, the literary pilgrim can often do with some professional help, whether to stop people like Borrow dragging their guides through a downpour or people like me gate-crashing silent retreats. So this is where the literary tourism programme comes into its own. You'll be glad to know we've moved on a great deal from George Borrow's day, both in terms of access arrangements and in expectations of comfort. For example, the tour on April 2nd, looking at Tessa Hadley's excellent novel, The London Train, of which we'll hear more shortly, will be a very civilised affair. It will actually take place on the train to Cheltenham Spa, with canapes and drinks served from the trolley, and a classical guitarist to provide entertainment. On May the 19th, Catherine Fisher, the Wales's Young People's Laureate, will lead a walk around the beautiful 17th century Tredegar House, where she was, in fact, a pupil when it was a convent school. She will also be leading an Arthur Machen trail through the Wye Valley. Elsewhere, Tony Brown will be showing us R.S. Thomas's Mynafon, Tony Curtis braving the passage to Caldy Island, Owen Shears travelling on horseback through the Llantoni Valley, and Jill Piercy and Cerridwen Lloyd Morgan will be exploring Brenda Chamberlain's Bangor. Ac yn Gymraeg wedyn, bydd gennym ni sesiwn ar ysgrifennu taith y Manna Grycheiniog gyda Llion Iwan. Bydd Jerry Hunter yn sôn am waith Kate Roberts ar traddodiad llechi yng Ngogledd Cymru. A bydd Lloyd Jones yn arwain taith ar Bwch Camlas yn Llangollen gan drafod a darllen o'i nofel Y Dŵr. Bydd Haf Llywelyn yn arwain taith o amgylch Castell Cynarfon a Fflir Dafydd yn agor trysorau'r Llyfrgell Genedlaethol. Ac yma yn y de bydd Gareth Miles a'r prifardd Hywel Griffiths yn arwain taith fws o amgylch Dyffryn Aman a chynefin y bardd T.E. Nicholas, sef Nicholas y Glais. Ac yn Cwm Rhondda, bydd tair o'n llenorion disgleiriad Manon Rhys, Christine James a Catherine Dafydd yn rhannu ysbrydoliaeth y ro arbennig honno gyda'i cyd-deithwyr. So it's an ambitious, rich and varied programme, with the chance to hear first-hand from some of our most distinguished critics and also, in many cases, from the authors themselves. Dychmyga'r faint o gael rhai o lenorion amlyca'r oes yn cyflwyno eu cynefin yn y fan ar lle. What a privilege to have a personal guided tour from the writers who have drawn inspiration from these very landscapes, and all for prices starting from as little as £4, and even less for concessions, although of course a bit more for the ones with the train and the horse. Felly garwn gymeradwyo rhaglen ddifyr ac arloesol hon i chi, ac i'ch cydnabod. Gobeithio y bydd yn cynnig ffordd newydd o uno, lle a llenyddiaeth yn y genedl hon. We believe this programme will offer a new way of uniting literature and locality in this nation. In commending it to you and your friends and colleagues, I would like to pay tribute to the staff of Llenyddiaeth Cymru Literature Wales for their tremendous work in putting the events together. A rydyn ni'n hynod o ffodus o gael staff mor ymroddedig a thalentog. and there are none more dedicated than the organisation's new Chief Executive, Lleyci Shenkin. And it's my pleasure now to welcome Lleyci to tell you a little more about the organisation's work. Pawch croeso I Lleyci Shenkin.
Diolch yn fawr, Graham. Thank you, Graham. Beth yw gweledigaeth Llenyddiaeth Cymru? What is our vision? Ein gweledigaeth ni yw ein bod yn sicrhau bod llenyddiaeth yn cyrraedd pob cwr o'r wlad. A bydd yn mentro tu hwnt i'r peiau traddodiadol, y stafell dosbarth, yr ysgol a'r llyfrgell, ac yn mynd i fannau gwahanol, newydd ac anusgoel. Bydd llenyddiaeth mewn ceiau, gorsafedd trenau, y stryd fawr, meysydd chwarae, llwybrau, trafferth, treithau, cloddiau, siopau, copawn, dyffrynoedd, ffatrioedd ac oriaulau cerdd. Mae rhaglen Twristiaeth Lenyddol a gyhoeddir heddiw yn mynd â ni gam yn agosach i'w reddi'r freuddwyd hon. It is our vision at Literature Wales to make literature accessible to and enjoyed by all. By doing this, we must work hard to ensure that literature travels far and wide, and that along the way we make sure we create a strong public impact. This new programme of literary tours does just that. It literally takes literature out there, on trains, boats, horseback, city centres, valleys, castles, great estates, the industrial and rural landscapes of Wales. It will shine a light on the richness of our cultural heritage, and what better way to see our country than through the words of our greatest writers. Un o'r teithiau mwyaf llwyddiannus yn y gorffennol yw un Waldo Williams yn Sir Benfro. Yn ei gerdd enwog mewn 2 gau, mae Waldo Williams yn disgrifio profiad rhyfedd a gafodd y fachgen ifanc rhwng 2 gau yn agos i'w gartref, Wein Parc y Blawd a Parc y Blawd. Cafodd weledigaeth, neu rith weledigaeth. Wrth i'r bardd geisio dwy'n i bof yr hyn a welodd yn ymrolio o'r môr goleuni, mae'r weledigaeth yn dechrau dod yn glir. Nes dyfod yr hollfyd, weithiau i'r tywelwch, ac ar y 2 barc, fe gerddau i bobl, a thrwyddyd, rhyngddyd, amdanynt ymdeinau, awen yn codio'r gydd, yn cydio'r cwbl. Uchafbwynt weledol y gerdd a'r hyn sy'n ganolog i'w weledigaeth yw'r percu llawn pobl. A gallu trosi'r weledigaeth hynod hon i'n weledigaeth ni yn Llenyddiaeth Cymru. Rhaid i ni sicrhau bod ni'n cydio'r cwbl, yn cynnwys. Ein dyletswydd ni'n sicrhau bod pob un yn Cymru y percu llawn pobl ni, beth bynnag o'i choed, cefndir, amgylchiadau, yn rhan y lenyddiaeth, a'n bod ni yn bwrw ein rhwyd amdanynt. One of the valuable things we learn on these literary tours is the intrinsic relationship between a writer and his or her landscape. An appreciation of the magic in the landscape of Pembrokeshire will help us understand better the words and worldview of Waldo Williams. Walking Llanthony Valley with him when she is, seeing spirited through his eyes, will make his poetry come alive to us. However, I'd like to go one step further and maybe turn this theory on its head. That we can only fully understand and appreciate a landscape once we've come to know and recognise the writers who've been inspired by that very land over the centuries. Wales is full of stories and poetry. Walk along the coastline of Anglesey and hear the murmurs of druids. Travel Arfon with the tales of Mabinogion in your head. Wander the Black Hills with Raymond Williams. Literature makes our landscape come alive, and literature connects communities. It's the psychology of a collective, expressed by an individual and enjoyed by us all. It is, I believe, the single most effective way to celebrate our unique cultural identity and to promote our country. Literature, therefore, is the perfect, natural tool for tourism. Ac mwyn cyflawni'r weledigaeth hon, rhaid i ni weithio mewn partneriaethau. Mae rhaglen Twristiaeth Lenyddol yn enghraifft wych o'r hyn yn gallu ei gyflawni trwy partneriaethu fel hyn, a rydyn ni'n hynod ddiolchgar i bob un ohonyn nhw. Yr Ymddiriedolaeth Genedlaethol, Pontio, Cadw, Trenau Rifa, Prifysgol Caerdydd, Parc Cenedlaethol Banau Brycheiniog, y Llyfrgell Genedlaethol, Llangollen Mawrth, Cyfeillion Caergors, Cymdeithas Nicholas y Glais, Prifysgol Bangor, Parc Cenedlaethol Afordir Penfro, Pathian, yr Eglwys yng Nghymru ac wrth gwrs Amgueddfa Genedlaethol ein partner ni yn arbennig heno yn yr achlysur hon. Ac enghraifft berffaith eleni o bartneriaeth yn ogystal â'r teithiau hyn yw, wrth gwrs, gwyl Llenyddiaeth Dineddol, a byddwch chi gyd erbyn hyn, mae'n siŵr wedi clywed amdani. Bydd hi'n cael ei chynnal yn Harc a Chastell Dineddol, penwythnos ola Mehefin, dechrau'r Gorffennaf, a mae'n gydweithrediad rhwng Llenyddiaeth Cymru, yr Ymddiriedolaeth Genedlaethol, a Phrifysgol Cymru a Drindod Dewi Sant trwy'r prosiect Corica. Mae tocynnau'r werth nawr yn mynd yn gwerthu'n eitha'r cyflym, ac os ych chi'n gweld Howard Marks, Gillian Clark, Rhys Iorwerth, Griff Rhys, John Davies, Julian Cope, oll mewn yn siarad ac yn canu, bod i'n mynwch eich tocynnau nawr. Tonight we celebrate partnership, and a little plug here before I move on to the Dineddol Literature Festival, so generously funded by the Arts Council, and is of course a perfect partnership between Literature Wales, the National Trust, and Corica, part of Trinity St David's. This would not have been possible without bringing these key organisations together. There would be poetry, music, comedy, children's entertainment, all under a scorching sun in a weekend in the end of June, I promise you. And the lineup is breathtaking. Tessa Hadley, Gillian Clark, Sir Andrew Motion, Broughton Book Club. I could go on, but please, hope to see you there. So in order to fulfil this great vision of taking literature to everyone and everywhere, we're going to need a little help. This varied programme that we're launching this evening would not have been possible without the collaboration of our many partners. The National Trust, Pontio, Cadw, Arriva Trains, Brecon Beacons National Park, Bangor University, Pembrokeshire Coast National Park, Parthian, the Church in Wales, Cardiff University, the National Library, Llangollen Wharf, Cyfeillion Caergors, Cymdeithas Nicholas y Glais, and of course National Museum Wales, our partners in particular this evening. We'll be very, very grateful for them. I'd also like to thank the Arts Council of Wales, of course, in particular the Chair, Professor Di Smith, for their utmost faith and belief in us as we developed into the new national company and developed our new vision in the last 18 months. It was the Arts Council who urged us to come together, Academy and Tina with, to create one body, Literature Wales, and I'm sure we've far exceeded their expectations already. I'd like to thank also board member Graham Davies for his contribution towards developing the literary tourism programme, and particularly my colleague Dr. Rowan Price for putting together such a fantastic programme. And I'd also like to especially thank Rowan Williams for giving us his time so generously this evening. He's a fellow of the Welsh Academy, an acclaimed poet and literary translator, amongst other famous accolades. But we're very grateful for him to be here this evening. So now it's my great pleasure as well to introduce our next speaker, Tessa Hadley, who of course is taking part in this tour. Tessa has the London train gig, which we're very excited about. She's a highly praised novelist and short story writer. She was born in Bristol and studied English at Cambridge University and is now senior lecturer in English and creative writing at Bath Spa University, but has lived in Cardiff since the 80s. She is also a fellow of the Welsh Academy, and her writing has been long-listed for the Guardian First Book Award, the Orange Prize and the Wales Book of the Year Award, and shortlisted for the Encore Award for Short Story in the US. She is a highly acclaimed writer, and we're very honoured to have her here this evening. Thank you, Professor.
It's lovely to be here, Crikey, and all of those honourable bodies that have been mentioned. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be here as part of this launch of Literature Wales Literary Tourism Programme, especially because I'm not only here at the launch, but as you've heard, my own event is going to be one of the first in the programme. I'm going to be reading from and talking about my novel, The London Train, which has in it a few train journeys between Cardiff and London, and I'm going to be doing it on an actual train. There's never an exact fit between life and literature, so there's something beautifully right in the fact that it won't take place on the London train, but on a train to Cheltenham. Literature on the way up to Cheltenham, and music and drinks and canapes on the way back. I can't think of any more innocent way of spending an evening. As they say in the Demotic, what's not to like? And yet, you know, it's also odd. Novelists are very clearer often than readers who complain, but I didn't like that character. Novelists are clear about those borders between life and literature, that checkpoint where the imagination crosses over into a different country. As a writer, I'm not sure why anyone would prefer talking about a book about a train on a train. I suppose we could run Anna Karenina train trips, which would end nastily, or 39 Steps train trips, where we had to climb out along the Forth Bridge to get away at the end. There's a kind of literalism at work here, isn't there? Not only wanting to read a book about a train on a train, but also in that much more time-honoured form of literary tourism, pilgrimages, to visit real places where books are supposed to be set, or to visit the study where the author once wrote the books. When we writers sit writing in that study, it's not really where we are. In fact, it's not even really us writing the stuff. It's not, at any rate, our ordinary, everyday selves. There's a funny sort of paradox in the writer using fiction to transcend and surpass the everyday conditions of his or her living, and the reader then determinedly returning the fiction to inside the place where it was made. The Brontes wrote to transcend the limitations of their Haworth, and ever since we've been determinedly putting them back inside it. At Larne, they've not only preserved Dylan Thomas's writing shed as he might have left it, but, this is my favourite thing, they've littered the floor with screwed up pieces of paper like rejected drafts for poems. I always wish I could go in there and unscrew the papers. Are they blank, or has somebody actually invented lines of bits of poems that didn't get through to the final draft? However, my detour into scepticism isn't my last word on the matter. How mean-spirited of me if it was. There's a marvellous short story by Henry James called The Birthplace, about a man who ends up as the reluctant custodian of the birthplace of a long-dead genius. Perhaps it's Shakespeare, we're never sure. For a while, our clever man can't bear it. He doesn't believe any of that nonsense. There's no evidence to say that was the actual cradle that the poet was once rocked in, or that was where he took his first tottering infant steps, or it was by the light of that window that he learned to read in his first horn book. Our clever man wants to disabuse the tourists because he believes they're wanting the wrong thing. Some of them have even been known to break off bits from the shrine to take away with them. He wants to explain to them that actually it's the poetry that matters. But at the end of the story, he changes his mind. Absolutely. He becomes famous for the inspiration he gives. He puts his heart and soul into the story he tells, showing the tourists around. He realises that the pilgrimage itself is a kind of poetry, that the visit to the sacred study is a parallel kind of story-making to the work the writer once did there. In the best and most romantic sense, the dreaming literalism of the novelist, inventing sheds and trains and cradles and characters out of thin air, is the same kind as the dreaming literalism of the reader, who wants to see the things that Charlotte Bronte touched, wants to visit the spaces Dylan Thomas wrote inside. And what's not to like about that?
Diolch yn fawr, Professor yn fawr iawn am hynna. Nawr, pleser ac anrhydedd yn awr yw cyflwyno ein prif siaradwr heno, Archesgob Caergaint, a parchidicad Dr. Rowan Williams. It's a pleasure and a privilege now to welcome our main speaker this evening, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend Dr. Rowan Williams. Dr. Williams, of course, joins us only a week after the announcement of his intention to move on from his role as Canterbury to take up the post of Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge. So tonight we can be among the first to express our best wishes to him in his new position. Felly pob llwyddiant I chi yn wir wrth I chi symud o Caergaint I Gaergrawnt. Dr. Williams is the 104th man to occupy the throne at Canterbury and the first since the Reformation to have been appointed from outside the Church of England. Achos, fel y gwyddom, y mae gwreiddiau Rowan Williams yn ddwfn yng nghymunedau Cymraeg Cymru yn ardal ystyr gynlais lle cafodd ei eni a'i fagu. His extraordinary intellectual abilities took him on the most illustrious of academic careers and then into a swift ascent through the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. In 2003, when he moved from his role as Archbishop of Wales to Canterbury, the Church in Wales and Wales as a whole certainly felt a mixture of pride at his achievements and sadness at his departure. But I can recall a wise commentator at the time saying that we should not look on this as Wales's loss, but rather as Wales's gift to the wider Church. Ehangu terfynau ein gwerthoedd am diwylliant oedd y symudiad hwnnw felly. And what a shift in perception can be achieved by the choice of a single word like that. Now, Dr. Williams knows a great deal about words. He's the author of many books in genres as diverse as theology, literary criticism, translation, apologetics, history, devotion and poetry. And he is, as you will be aware, an excellent poet himself. No doubt we can look forward to an even greater output when he relinquishes the huge responsibilities of his current role as leader of the 80 million or so Anglicans across the world. But tonight, on home ground, we look forward to hearing him tell us what the literatures of Wales, which mean so much to us, mean to him. Gadewch I ni roi croeso cynnes iawn. Please let's give a very warm welcome to Dr. Rowan Williams.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, a diolch I Llenyddiaeth Cymru am wahoddiad siarad heno. I'm very grateful for the opportunity of speaking this evening. And I've been given one thought already by Tessa in her remarks about the possible futures of this project. She mentioned Anna Karenina. Now, I owe to Di Smith, present here this evening, the remark made by Rowan Williams that given the patterns of industrial export in the 19th century, probably the last words that Anna Karenina read before the train rode over her were made in Dalais. So if you wished to extend Welsh literary tours to St. Petersburg, I'm sure that would be very welcome. My mother's father was a bookbinder. Among other things, he also ran a butcher's business in Ystradgynlais. But as a keen bookbinder, he would gather together all sorts of unlikely and unexpected books which had come his way. Not all of them seemed to find their way back to their original owners. So when I was a child, there were always unexpected books lying around the place, waiting to be bound. And one of those unexpected books was a pocket edition of Charlotte Guest's translation of the Mabinogion. And I suppose I must have been about 8 when I began to work my way laboriously through these complex stories in rather unrewarding Victorian typeface. The Mabinogion is full of stories which could be called the fusion of Lle and Llenyddiaeth. They are about place in a very particular way. Look at the catalogues of names that you find. Look at the importance of location. At the very beginning, Pedair Cainc, but look also at the extraordinary literary tourism implied in Culhwch a Olwen, where you have a rather bewildering tour of sites all around South and West Wales, the location of which is extremely obscure, even to the most expert of scholars in the field. But it's a reminder that early literature of that kind is deeply invested in place. Stories are not told in mid-air. Stories are told to explain why places are the way they are, why place names are as they are, and somehow to invite you to read a landscape in terms of its human history, of conflict, of sorcery, of romance. A reminder that landscape itself never just sits there for the human eye and the human mind. Landscape is always more than it seems, and it waits for words to bring it alive again and again. Imaginative art, whether poetry, fiction, or the visual arts, or whatever, imaginative art always tunes into that something more, that unexpressed and unexplored residue in the world around us. Imaginative art says that our relation to the world around is not passive. That the landscapes given us, the landscapes of thought and story and literary of place, are there so that we may recreate. I won't give you the excursus on theology at this point, though it cries out to be made. But I will simply say that this declares something so important about the nature of our humanity that we lose sight of it at our peril and our cost. We need to understand ourselves. More and more we need to understand ourselves in a shrinking, oppressive cultural environment. To understand ourselves as people whose relation to our environment, material, political, social, imaginative, is not passive. We are engaging with and wrestling with what is given. We are drawing out of it more than seems to be there. We are making it new. And that is perhaps why we are so fascinated by the literary landscape. We go to a place, a setting, where we begin to get some sense of how one mind and heart and imagination reacted to the invisible, the extra, and perhaps our own sense of the invisible and the extra is kindled at that moment. Well, the Mabinogion lasted me quite a while, and indeed is still something I return to with delight. But in secondary school, I'm sorry, there's going to be quite a lot of school reminiscence in all this. In secondary school, of course, other things began to happen. We started learning Welsh. That is to say, we started learning proper Welsh. We learned that the Welsh we had learned from our parents was ungrammatical and unsatisfactory. And it's a shame, really, looking back on the teaching of Welsh in those days, that that was the first impression many of us had who came from homes in which Welsh was spoken. That the Welsh of our parents and our families was somehow second-rate. I think we've got beyond that in Wales today. But some of the tension and conflict between different kinds of Welsh is one of the themes that cries out for more exploration and more reflection, I think, as we look at our recent history, especially in the post-war period. That's another story. But although my fluency then and now in Welsh is pretty faulty, I began to learn to spell my way through some of the more recent literature of Wales, and as the years went on, discovered more and more landscapes of the imagination opening up there. But one particular landscape, which has not much to do with the language, but to do with the history, opened up very, very differently when we had a history teacher at school who suggested that for our O-level history and more for our O-level history than for our O-level English, it has to be said, we should start reading some novels about Welsh industrial history. My friends and I worked our way through Alexander Cordell and Richard Llewellyn with more of a sense of duty than enjoyment sometimes, but with an enhanced sense there of place and history as something that did not belong in a remote literary context, but was the flesh and blood of what we were actually learning about in note form in our history lessons. But the people we were learning about in history lessons were individuals with relationships, with tragedies, with joys. It's all too easy to look back on those novels of industrial life with a degree of superiority and scepticism. And of the film version of How Green Was My Valley, I can only quote what I think Queen Elizabeth said to a disobedient lady-in-waiting at some point around 1590, "God may forgive you, but I never shall." But it meant that when my aspiring literary friends and I were in the sixth form, one of the things we attempted to do, in a not completely serious spirit, was to draft an outline for the great Welsh novel. We felt that after years of exposure to Richard Llewellyn and Alexander Cordell, we could do this standing on our heads. And I recently rediscovered my sixth form notebook, which contains, for future literary historians, an outline of the great Welsh novel, and all great Welsh novels, corporately drafted by myself and 3 friends in the lower sixth of Ddigwyddiadau in Swansea in 1967. I am considering to whom I should leave this unique literary treasure, and I'm willing at the end of this evening to receive any bids that you would like to make for this remarkable document. Easy, as I say, to look down on it, easy to parody it. And yet, it is one of the ways for us to enter into the humanity of our own Welsh history. And that's one reason why I don't despise it entirely. But it was probably in that same sixth form period that I, and again some of my friends, began to become seriously aware of the Anglo-Welsh poetic tradition. R.S. Thomas was already, of course, on the O-level syllabus, some people even in the 1960s. But with the publication of Welsh Voices, I think 1967, and The Lilting Planet, that began to come into focus a little more clearly for us. Other voices entered the scene. My first exposure to the work of David Jones was through some of those collections of Anglo-Welsh verse at that time. And I seem to remember there was a promising youngish poet by the name of Gillian Clark, whose name first came across my horizon around that time also. And that particular wandering star has continued to shine with greater and greater brilliance in the firmament. And I'm very happy to pay that tribute tonight, Julie. But those voices were, of course, if you were at school in Swansea, somewhat drowned out by the great local voice of Dylan Thomas. And like every aspiring adolescent poet in Swansea at the time, I began to produce reams of second-rate imitations of Dylan Thomas. Some of those, again, still exist, I'm afraid, not in manuscript form, but in printed form in the school magazine. And in this particular context, I am willing to offer large sums to buy up any surviving copies of those. But we were also aware, and I remember being told about this by our English teacher at the time, of another Swansea poet, the one I've myself dubbed Swansea's other poet, Vernon Watkins. We were told about his death at that time, I remember, and I began to read some of his work and get a sense of the enormous variety of Welsh literatures. And I'm very glad indeed that the title offered me tonight was Welsh Literatures, because of course I had already talked about a variety of literatures, a particular kind of semi-populist prose fiction, an archaic tradition of prose romance, a tradition of English language writing, various traditions of Welsh language writing. And around that same time, of course, the Penguin Book of Welsh Verse was published. And for me, and I guess for others, that was yet another doorway into unexpected riches. And what I began to understand, wrestling with the Penguin Book and with some of the originals, and I could decipher them, what I began to understand was something about poetry itself, not simply what I referred to earlier about the way in which poetry, like the other arts, draws out what is invisible in an environment, but something also about the way in which poetry, exceptionally and unusually, not in total discontinuity with the other arts, poetry deliberately turns up the tension in language in order to bring certain things to light. Poetry tightens the screws of language. It quite literally tightens the stress of language. That's to say, it works with the patterns of stress and slack, the in-breathing and out-breathing of speech. It sharpens those up so as to bring contours out from language itself that you hadn't suspected. And it was the introductory essay to that same Penguin Book of Welsh Verse that spelled out in accessible ways just how that worked in the classical traditions of Welsh poetry. How by submitting yourself to an exceptionally sophisticated and prohibitively difficult discipline, you forced language, you might almost say, to deliver up some of its secrets. You drew out, again, what was invisible and unsuspected, just as in a literal landscape, so with words themselves, the requirements of assonance and rhyme draw out something of the meanings of words that you never suspected. Once again, it's about language being an intensely active, an intensely generative matter, not just flat description, not just semi-passive response. When I went on to graduate study at Oxford after reading theology at Cambridge, I had a very pleasant surprise in finding that my doctoral supervisor, the late Donald Alchin, known to many here, I think, was an enthusiast for the Welsh literary tradition. On one of the first occasions I met him to have a supervision about 20th century Russian religious thought, he sat me down and made me read aloud to him from Iros Bowen. And it was Donald who introduced me to Iros Bowen a year or two later for a conversation that I shall long remember. So I was once again brought back to an engagement with a particular kind of poetic tradition. And in the years that followed, that continued to draw me back with a high degree of enthusiasm, engagement, and sometimes a sense of being rather intimidated. It was about 25 years ago that, revisiting some of those poems I'd read in translation in the sixth form, I began to undertake the discipline of trying to translate. And it was indeed Rowan Williams' Llenyddiaeth. It was the first substantial Welsh poem I tried my hand at translating. And that discipline of translation has been for me, for the last, I suppose, 20 years now, a very significant part of my own attempt to engage with the traditions that I inherit as a reader of Welsh literatures. Translation is particularly difficult when it is dealing with a literary genre or set of literary genres so intensely technical, so intensely intricate and self-referential. There are things you cannot do in Welsh poetry and translation, and I found early on I had to stop trying to do them. But that doesn't absolve you from the effort to get inside the flow and the energy of a poem. And it was in translating Waldo, in the first instance, that I began to see ways of translating other poets in other languages, and such work as I've attempted in translating from German and from Russian in more recent years has had a lot to do with what I learned in that initial exercise. Don't look so much at how the poet is doing it. Try to attune yourself to the movement of metaphors if you want to translate, and you'll find your own how. The rhythm, or what the French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain called the pulsions, are what you have to attend to. Not in any way that makes the particulars of the language and the technique dispensable or secondary, far from it. But if you're going to translate, you're going to be doing something completely different. And so you have to find what level it is that can actually be reshaped, rendered in another form. And I wrote some years ago a little essay on the experience of trying to translate Llenyddiaeth, an essay which I revisited recently and of course wanted to rewrite almost every sentence of, because the experience of translating goes on, requiring its own translation. You've been very, very patient in listening to my autobiographical ramblings, but I feel obliged to try and draw together the points that might be of substance and might be of interest for this wonderful project that we're involved in launching. And I have to say that it is a brilliant, imaginative venture to which I wish every possible success. And the important things seem to me to be about, in very basic primary school terms, learning to look and learning to listen. Learning to look. Sharing that experience of a place. Looking at what is there and trying to sense something of the drawing out of what isn't there or isn't yet there by the imagination. That's a real kindling of our own capacity, our own freedom. It's an ambitious way of talking about literary tourism. But if literary tourism is to be more than just literary tourism, if it's actually to be something that is humanly important for people involved in it, that's the level at which it needs to work. Trying to get in touch with what it is that makes somebody's imagination grasp what is not yet there, and somehow mysteriously add to what is there by their own imaginative response. As I said earlier, that's not a luxury or some elitist kind of response to the arts. It's about rediscovering a credible political and social humanity at a time when different kinds of barbarism threatens. The second thing, as I hinted, is in that entry into the imagination, and that search for the pulsions, the energy in imaginative work, what we are doing for ourselves is turning up the tension a little bit. Responding to or pushing back a little bit against the slackness of habitual response. Understanding that difficulty is good for us. Again, not in a perversely elitist sense, not in a Mandarin way, but to understand that we have work to do with our imaginations, in our relationships, in our environment, in our society. Work to do, and the capacity and the gift to do it. The project that we're concerned about this evening is one which has enormous promise for the health of our society, not just for the entertainment of dedicated readers. I was really delighted to hear Lleucu underlining just how global, just how comprehensive the vision was, where we need to get all this vision, all this energy. And since, as Providence would have it, I was speaking only last night about Rowan Williams, I can only echo with delight that particular reference to the fields full of folk that Waldo envisages in that key passage of the poem. And of course to what emerges from that, Owen and Cordior Key, something arising from the hiddenness of people's lives that enlivens and inspirits. That Owen, arising from what's hidden, has been what I've constantly sensed, related to, in my own encounters with the literatures of Wales. And I'm delighted to think that those riches and those gifts will be so abundantly available to so many more people through this project, and I wish it well. Diolch yn fawr iawn.